The night sky over Qatar lit up in fire. Sirens screamed through the vast sprawl of Al-Udeid airbase as explosions ripped across the desert floor. Barracks shook with the impact of missiles slamming into the largest U.S. installation in the Middle East. Windows shattered, alarms blared, and soldiers scrambled for cover as smoke and flames consumed hangars filled with vital equipment. For decades, Al-Udeid had stood as the symbol of American dominance in the Gulf, a fortress bristling with aircraft and command centers. But in a single, shocking strike, Iran had sent a message the world could not ignore. America's power was not untouchable. Reports filtered in amid the chaos. Dozens of U.S. personnel wounded, emergency medical units stretched to their limits, critical infrastructure crippled. The attack was not a random strike by militias or shadowy proxies. It was Iran itself, claiming responsibility in bold defiance, announcing that this was retaliation for America's secret operation, known only by its chilling code name, Midnight Hammer. What was supposed to be a show of strength by Washington had instead provoked a blow that left one of its most secure bastions reeling. Panic spread quickly across Washington. Overnight, intelligence briefings turned into crisis meetings. Analysts whispered that this was not just another exchange of blows in a shadow war. It was a direct hit on the very heart of U.S. military power in the region. A line had been crossed. The United States, long accustomed to fighting from secure bases far beyond enemy reach, had been struck where it lived. For soldiers on the ground, the reality was even more immediate. Fire crews battled flames that threatened to spread through fuel depots. Medics worked frantically to stabilize the wounded as helicopters ferried the most critical cases out of the blast zone. Commanders tried to restore order while the airbase remained under lockdown, fearing more missiles could follow. In those desperate hours, the U.S. military confronted a chilling truth. Iran had proven it could hit back harder than anyone expected. Where are you watching this from right now? Tell us, because this is not just another clash in the Middle East. It is a turning point, a warning that the balance of power may be shifting. And if you want to follow how this dangerous story unfolds, stay with us, because what happened in Qatar could ignite a fire far beyond the desert. It began in silence, cloaked under the name Midnight Hammer. Few outside the Pentagon even knew it had taken place until Iranian officials thundered about it on state television. The operation was meant to be swift and surgical, a series of strikes designed to cripple Iranian proxy networks across Iraq and Syria. Intelligence reports had shown convoys moving weapons, missile parts, and advanced drones through hidden depots. Washington decided it was time to send a message. Under the cover of darkness, American drones and stealth aircraft struck deep. Warehouses erupted into fireballs, command centers were reduced to rubble, and armed convoys vanished in blasts that lit up the desert night. Special operations forces slipped in and out, gathering intelligence and confirming targets destroyed. In Washington, it was hailed behind closed doors as a success, an operation that would weaken Tehran's reach and prove America still controlled the tempo of conflict in the Middle East. But the victory was short-lived. Hours after the strikes, Iranian leaders declared the U.S. had crossed a red line. The Revolutionary Guard vowed revenge, not through proxies, but directly. Tehran's rhetoric was unusually sharp, almost daring Washington to underestimate its resolve. One senior commander told Iranian media, "America struck us in the shadows. We will strike back in the light." That warning was not idle. For years, Iran had tested the boundaries, harassing oil tankers, launching drones at Saudi facilities, supporting militias that bled American troops in Iraq. But never before had it carried out an attack this bold, this direct, on a U.S. stronghold. Midnight Hammer had been intended to remind Iran of America's dominance. Instead, It triggered the very retaliation commanders in Washington feared most. Inside the White House Situation Room, the debate turned bitter. Some advisors argued that Tehran's threats were empty bluster. Others warned that Iran had both the weapons and the will to escalate. Yet no one predicted the audacity of what came next: a missile strike on Al-Udeid, the crown jewel of America's Middle Eastern presence. When the first explosions hit the base, it became clear that Midnight Hammer had not weakened Iran. It had awakened it. The strike came just before dawn. Soldiers at Al-Udeid were beginning another ordinary rotation, some preparing for early flights, others grabbing breakfast in the mess hall, when the first alarms shattered the stillness. A low rumble in the distance grew into a roar, and then the desert horizon lit up as incoming missiles streaked toward the base. Within seconds, the ground shook violently. The first warhead slammed into an aircraft hangar, igniting a fireball that sent shockwaves through the compound. Glass windows shattered across the barracks. The second struck near a fuel storage depot, its blast so powerful it threw parked vehicles into the air like toys. Then came more, in rapid succession, pounding the runways, command buildings, and living quarters. The base was designed with hardened shelters and missile defenses, but not everything could be stopped. Iran had chosen its moment well, saturating defenses with speed and precision. Chaos erupted. Airmen sprinted for cover, some diving into trenches, others pressed flat against concrete walls as debris rained down. Sirens wailed. Over loudspeakers, commanders barked orders to lock down sections of the base. Smoke plumes billowed skyward, visible for miles across the Qatari desert. The acrid smell of burning fuel and twisted metal filled the air. Medics rushed in as the first reports of casualties spread. Dozens were injured, some with shrapnel wounds, others from the concussive force of the blasts. Helicopters evacuated the most critically wounded to nearby hospitals. Fire crews fought desperately to contain blazes threatening to spread through hangars filled with munitions and equipment. What stunned many on the ground was not just the ferocity of the attack, but its precision. This was no random barrage. The missiles had been carefully targeted at the most vital assets: fuel supplies, aircraft shelters, command posts. It was clear that Tehran's intelligence networks had mapped the base, selecting targets that would cause maximum disruption. For soldiers caught in the middle, the attack was surreal. Al-Udeid had always felt like an impenetrable fortress, a sprawling hub of U.S. air power in the Middle East. Now, that illusion was shattered. One officer described the moment as watching the unthinkable unfold in real time. Another said simply, "We were no longer safe." In Washington, the first reports were met with disbelief. Al-Udeid wasn't just another overseas base. It was the nerve center of CENTCOM operations, coordinating missions across the entire region. To see it burning, under direct fire, was to realize that America's greatest stronghold in the Gulf had been pierced. The message from Tehran was unmistakable. The U.S. could bleed, and Iran could make it happen. In Washington, the mood shifted from disbelief to outright panic. Within minutes of the first reports, the White House Situation Room was filled with generals, intelligence chiefs, and senior advisors. Screens lit up with live satellite feeds of Al-Udeid, the flames still visible from space. Real-time casualty updates trickled in, each one worse than the last. The unthinkable had happened. Iran had struck directly at the very core of America's military power in the Gulf. The president demanded answers. How had the missiles gotten through? Why hadn't defenses intercepted them all? Pentagon officials explained that Iran had likely used a combination of short-range ballistic missiles and drones, launched in a coordinated wave to overwhelm radar systems. Some were shot down, but enough slipped through to leave the base crippled. The room fell silent as the scale of the disaster became clear. Dozens of wounded, millions of dollars in damage, and the chilling realization that Iran had proven it could bypass America's defenses. On Capitol Hill, the political storm erupted instantly. Hawks thundered that the United States must retaliate with overwhelming force. They called for airstrikes on Iranian missile facilities, naval deployments to the Strait of Hormuz, even the possibility of hitting Revolutionary Guard command centers inside Iran itself. If we don't respond decisively, one senator warned, every enemy in the world will see weakness. But others counseled restraint. They argued that an all-out confrontation with Iran would spiral into a regional war, dragging in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Hezbollah, igniting a firestorm from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. One wrong move, a senior advisor cautioned, and we'll be looking at the largest Middle Eastern conflict in a generation. Allies weighed in with alarm. Qatar, host of the base, demanded assurances that it would not be dragged into a war it never asked for. European leaders urged calm, warning that escalation would devastate global oil markets and destabilize already fragile diplomatic efforts. Yet privately, many admitted that the strike had changed everything. For the first time, Iran had shown it could wound America where it mattered most. Inside the Pentagon, the debate turned personal. Some generals argued that failing to respond forcefully would embolden Tehran and undermine deterrence across the globe. Others warned that a reckless strike could backfire, triggering waves of attacks on U.S. troops and bases throughout Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf. One official put it bluntly, "Iran has just called our bluff. If we hit back too hard, the whole region burns. If we don't, we look weak. Either way, we've already lost ground." The sense of crisis deepened with every passing hour. Markets wobbled, oil prices spiked, and the world watched as Washington struggled to decide its next move. In the streets of Tehran, crowds cheered what state media declared a victory against American aggression. In Washington, leaders wrestled with a haunting truth. The United States was no longer untouchable. Do you think the U.S. should strike back hard or hold back to avoid a wider war? The question now loomed not just in the halls of power, but across the globe. The strike on Al-Udeid was more than a single act of retaliation. It was a strategic earthquake. For decades, America's presence in the Middle East had been anchored on the belief that its forward bases were untouchable, shielded by advanced defenses and overwhelming deterrence. Now, that illusion had been torn apart. If Iran could hit Al-Udeid, then no U.S. installation in the region was truly safe. The implications spread like cracks in glass. In Iraq and Syria, American troops suddenly found themselves more vulnerable than ever. Militias aligned with Tehran, emboldened by Iran's audacity, began planning their own strikes, confident that the U.S. was reeling. In the Gulf, commanders worried about Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, all home to key American assets, now painted with invisible targets. Even the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, a pillar of U.S. naval dominance, could no longer be assumed secure. For Iran, the message was clear and deliberate. America might have the bigger arsenal, but Tehran could reach out and strike directly. By targeting Al-Udeid, Iran had shown its strength without crossing into full-scale war. It had inflicted pain while stopping short of triggering automatic U.S. escalation. It was a calculated risk, one that shifted the psychological balance of power in the region. In Washington, analysts warned of a dangerous precedent. If Al-Udeid was vulnerable, so were U.S. bases in Europe and Asia. Rivals like China and Russia were watching closely. Beijing studied the strike as a model for overwhelming U.S. bases in Guam or Japan, with missile salvos in a Taiwan conflict. Moscow saw how a single bold act could fracture U.S. confidence and embolden allies. The global balance had tilted, not just in the Gulf, but everywhere America's forward-deployed forces relied on the assumption of safety. The strategic risks went further still. Oil markets convulsed, fearing more attacks in the Gulf. Shipping insurers raised rates overnight, calculating the danger of missiles or drones near vital choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. Every nation that depended on Gulf energy, Europe, India, China, suddenly saw its lifeline in jeopardy. One more strike could send prices soaring and trigger global economic shockwaves. And yet, the greatest risk of all was escalation. If Washington retaliated too forcefully, Iran could unleash its arsenal of missiles, drones, and proxy forces across the region. U.S. troops in Iraq could be targeted. Israel could be dragged into direct confrontation with Hezbollah. Saudi oil facilities could burn again, as they did in 2019. The tinderbox of the Middle East was waiting for a spark, and Al-Udeid might have been it. The world held its breath. Would the U.S. respond with overwhelming force, risking a regional war? Or would it pull back, swallowing the humiliation and buying time? Both paths carried dangers. Both threatened to reshape the global order. The desert night still glowed with the fires of Al-Udeid. Even as rescue crews worked through the rubble, even as medics fought to save the wounded, the strike had already traveled far beyond Qatar. In Washington, in Tehran, in every capital watching the Gulf, the meaning was unmistakable. America had been hit where it thought itself strongest. For decades, the United States relied on the assumption that its forward bases were untouchable, its dominance unquestioned. That myth was shattered in a matter of minutes. Iran had pierced the shield, showing that no fortress was safe, no command post beyond reach. The images of burning hangars and wounded soldiers carried a message far louder than any speech. The balance of fear had shifted. Now Washington stands at a crossroads. Retaliate with overwhelming force, and the region could plunge into a war no one can control. A war stretching from the Strait of Hormuz to the Mediterranean, from Israel to Iraq. Hold back, and the world may see weakness, emboldening Tehran and every other adversary watching closely. Either path carries danger. Either path risks rewriting the future of American power. The attack on Al-Udeid was more than a strike. It was a warning, a reminder that even the greatest military on earth can be wounded, that the next war may not begin on America's terms, and that the fire spreading across the Gulf could one day consume far more than a single base. What should America do now? Strike back or step back? Tell us what you think, because the decision that follows may shape not just the Middle East, but the future of war itself.